Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on Built to Fail, Heathrow Terminal 5, a retrospective. We have 5 wonderful presenters today. And before we start with the webinar, I want to give a brief introduction to the Lean Construction blog in case this is the first time you are joining us. The goal of the Lean Construction blog is to democratize and advance Lean around the world. And we do so by making Lean construction accessible to everybody by being the most accurate, comprehensive, and convenient online resource. We started the Lean Construction blog in 2015. Since we started, we have reached more than a million unique visitors, more than 2.5 million page views, and we continue to publish a blog post every single week. So since we started, we have more than 500 blog posts. We do a free webinar every single month, and we do 2 virtual conferences per year. So in general, interest for lean design and construction has increased throughout the world, and we're hoping to drive more and more interest in it in order to improve the way that we design and build projects. So the core of lean construction blogs are blog posts. When we first started, the information on lean was only available at academic conferences and in research papers. And our goal is to make that information more accessible and less intimidating for people to get access to. So really, with a blog post, you can simply read for a few minutes to get 1 or 2 ideas, and then you can use those ideas for your own projects. If you're brand new to lean construction, we do have a free ebook on the website. You can use the QR code here, or when you go to the website, you go down to the footer, and then you can download the ebook to explain what is lean construction, what's the philosophy, and how you can get started with some of these ideas. And we currently have the ebook in English and French, and we are going to have a Spanish version out very soon. With the Lean Construction blog, we host 2 virtual conferences per year. We have a conference coming up next week in September on lean construction in the field. This event is focused on people who are applying lean in the projects. So superintendents, project managers, foremen, project executives, and project engineers. So really it's a field-focused event for field leaders. In March, we have the Last Planner System Conference, where we cover wider topics of production planning and control, project production management, and then integrated project delivery. So that's going to be in March. And then we also have an online academy where we have online courses taught by lean construction practitioners, and you can take any course you want. The goal is that as the course gets updated with new knowledge, you get access to the latest content, and the goal is for you to get 2 to 4 hours of content in an area for you to have deep knowledge and for you to have a way to really get started into that area. And finally, we do have corporate sponsorship for companies. And the goal of corporate sponsorship is to get brand recognition, to be on our newsletter, our social media. And we also get 25 tickets to each upcoming virtual conference. And you get access to all our webinar and conference recordings. So far, we have over 180 hours of content in our library, and we're adding on more and more content every single month as we do more webinars and more conferences. So I'm going to turn this over to Gary Fisher, who's going to be moderating the panel. So Gary spent 40 years at Chevron. He's currently the director of the Project Production Institute, a nonprofit focused on disseminating the best practices of operational science and project production management for the design and construction industry. Gary, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
All right, let me share my screen. What is going on here? Let me try that again. This all worked great in the practice. try that again. There we go. What the heck? Huh. Well, I'll back up. All right. I think we're set. So we've got about an hour roughly for our panel discussion. If questions pop in your head, please use the chat to give us questions. And then we're going to have about 20 or 30 minutes at the end where we can take questions directly, or we'll continue to take them in chat. So thank you all for tuning in. I think you got a really special treat in front of you. The Heathrow Terminal 5 expansion was by any measure just a massive undertaking. And I want to say right off the bat here that at the completion of the project, the House of Commons did an investigation or an inquiry or an after action report to really study the project and summarize the results. So I want you to know, have some confidence that what you're going to hear about today is not smoke and mirrors. There's no spin. These are just the facts on what really happened. So T5 was really doubled the terminal space at Heathrow. Took, you can just see the scope here, just massive civil infrastructure, huge basement, redirected 2 rivers, integrated it to one of the major freeways in the UK. New aircraft, taxiway bridges, stands, new control tower. You can get a feel for this. This was one complex undertaking. But it took something like 20 years from conception to completion and put into operation. 6 years alone for construction. Just hugely complex, as you're going to be able to hear about in a few minutes. This is a great shot. You can see there's an active runway on the back, an active runway on the front, both sides of the project. And then, of course, the M25 right next to it, it was the main access for the highway. You can imagine 880 concurrent projects. You can imagine the number of craft workers, people. It's been estimated the people touched by this project through its life were somewhere around 60,000. I mean, that's just huge, hugely complex. And if you've ever had the chance to fly in and out of Heathrow or travel to get in and out of Heathrow, you just get a taste of how difficult executing a project in this environment was. Very constrained. And this really demanded a fresh approach, especially given the backdrop of challenge projects going on in the UK while this project was being developed. You can take a look here, what was the norm? Late and over budget, right? Which UK doesn't have the corner on this market. If you look at infrastructure projects or any mega projects around the world, pretty similar results. Well, this performance led to the formation of a task force led by Sir John Egan to study and propose solutions. And that report was really a groundbreaking work, as you're going to hear about in a few minutes. It was really a catalyst for taking a different approach on T5. So let's read the back of the book to begin with. How did this play out? As I mentioned, that investigation that occurred up after the project was completed by the House of Commons. This is the opening line in the report. BA's opened Heathrow Terminal, 5th terminal for business on 27 March after 6 years of construction at a cost of £4.3 billion on time and within budget. Just let that soak in. On time and within budget. I mean, really? Given the challenge and the complexity, they pulled this off. It's really, really remarkable results. I mean, just think about it. I was more familiar with the Denver airport construction, okay? And that one was 200% over budget and 16 months late, and had some really serious operational problems that went on for, in fact, I think they finally jettisoned their baggage handling system that was a novel approach. So these were just remarkable results. So, how did they achieve this? What did they do? And especially, what can we learn from it? And I think it's important, but as we dive into this with our panel, that T5 was really the first large-scale application of what lean construction was intended to be. Relational contracting, first application of last planner, first application of production control, really first to take a systems approach on a mega project. So today we're really privileged to have a panel of gentlemen who all played significant roles in the success of T5. So let's get the ball rolling with Simon Murray. So Simon, you were tasked with creating a whole new approach, right? Please tell us about that and why, what BAA did, how they approached the project, and why they did it the way they did it.
Thank you, Gary. First, a bit of context. It's really important. These massive projects don't exist in isolation. They exist within a political, business, and economic context. In the early 1980s, the UK's major airports were owned mostly by local authorities and by the government through the British Airports Authority, classic public organisation. And in 1986, the government decided to privatise the three big London airports, Heathrow, Gatwick and Stansted, and four regional airports, creating BAA PLC, which was a quoted company, a company quoted on the London Stock Exchange. Now, an important feature of privatisation, it's important to understanding why we did these things, an important feature of privatisation was that the landing fees that BAA charged to its airlines were regulated using what's called an RPI plus X formula. So what this meant was the amount by which BAA could increase its landing charges every year depended on the amount it invested in its infrastructure and on improvements in its performance. And this was the X, was the amount it could exceed the retail price index. So now, moving on, by 1990, or in 1990, Sir John Egan was appointed chief executive of BAA. His background was in the automotive industry. He'd been 10 or 12 years as chairman of Jaguar Cars. He was the guy that sold Jaguar to Ford. And also, at around about that time, Heathrow had become, or was becoming, the busiest international airport in the world and was running out of capacity. Now, the capacity problem was not in the runways. You know, the gradual replacement of smaller passenger aircraft with larger aircraft like the Boeing, 757, 767, 747, meant that there was spare capacity in the runways. The big problem was terminal capacity. And the solution, it took a long time to get to this, but the solution that Sir John Egan and his executive team came up with was to build Terminal 5, and as you've seen in the pictures, but to build it within the existing airport boundary, in fact, between the runways. And it would, little did we know at the time, it would take nearly 10 years to get planning permission, and it would cost more than £4 billion. Now, the challenge for BAA as a new listed public company was to find a way of delivering Terminal 5 without, to quote John Egan, holding the company below the waterline. So let's just explore that challenge a bit more. I joined BAA in October 1994 as development director, and I was tasked with working out how to deliver Terminal 5. That was my job. And I remember in my very first working meeting with John Egan, he explained to me that under the current 5-year regulatory agreement, our airport charges were being reduced every year. So it wasn't RPI plus, it was RPI minus 2%. Every year, our charges to the airline went down by 2% in real terms. And at the same time, construction costs in our existing infrastructure program are increasing at RPI plus 4.5%, or 4.6% to be precise. And as John pointed out, if this situation continues, or would continue, T5 would be unaffordable by the time construction began. So my job was to work out how to close that gap. Now, in very early stages of looking at how to do this, it became clear to us that if we carried on just appointing architects and consultants to design the terminal and contractors to build it, nothing was going to change. You do it the same old way, you get the same old results. So we needed a radical new approach. And it took us about 18 months to develop that approach, and a further 4 years to really create the organization, the supply chains, and the infrastructure to be able to deliver it. And in the end, as Gary's pointed out, it worked. T5 was delivered on time within budget. And more than that, much more than that, and we'll come on to this, T5 was, and is, an extremely efficient airport terminal. If we'd done it the same old way, the architects and consulting engineers would have designed it for us. As it was, our approach meant that we had total control of the project. So we actually not only produced on time within budget, but far more important than that, from an infrastructure point of view, we produced an extremely efficient terminal. And every time I go through it, my kids always dread going to T5. Well, they're all grown up now, but they always say, if we get a T5, please don't talk about the bloody project. So anyway, now moving on to what was this approach. Now, I don't have time to describe this approach in detail. So what I want to do is just to highlight a few of the key features or principles on which this approach was based. And as I say, this took a lot of time, a lot of intellectual effort, a lot of going around the world, listening to people and exploring to actually get to that. The first feature, and I would say it's probably the most important feature of all, is that we recognized that to get this done, BAA had to act as an owner, not as a client. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as an airport operator, we knew how to configure efficient terminals. We knew how to operate terminals efficiently. And we knew how to deliver construction in congested airports. We were the experts. So why should we hand that over to consultants and contractors and merely be their client? You know, right at the beginning, we got rid of the word client in the organization. We used to call ourselves the owner. And we began to act and think like an airport, like an airport owner. And we recognized we had to control the design process. That doesn't mean we had to employ all the designers, but it meant that we had to lead. And we had to develop the whole way of doing this project and lead the delivery of it. The second feature or principle was that we had to rethink our supply chains. At a very early stage, we realized that our contractors, who were by the way, they're all good companies, our consultants and contractors, I'm not knocking them, but we realized that our contractors actually knew very little about their supply chains. They'd got so into this transactional behavior and bidding everything as subcontracts and trying to get cheap prices that they didn't have any real relationships with suppliers. They only had contracts with suppliers. So we realized that they were not going to be our source of knowledge. So instead, we set out to learn from companies like Nissan in the UK, who have a big manufacturing operation here, Tesco, our largest supermarket chain, and Unipart, which is sort of exemplar organization in the UK in terms of supply chain management and efficient delivery. And we spent a lot of time with it. The great thing about having John Egan as a boss is he knew the chief execs of all these companies really, really well. So he'd say, oh, you got to go and see Terry Leahy at Tesco, you got to go and see this guy. And through all these contacts and David and his colleagues and others got, in lots and lots of detailed meetings with people, we began to work out for ourselves what our supply chain should look like. And we came up with a design based on direct and collaborative relationships with our strategic suppliers, the people who made the stuff that really made a difference, and more traditional relationships with our commodity suppliers. So we bought things like cement, in the traditional way. But when it came down to things that were mission critical, and they were surprising. For example, it may surprise you that one of the strategic suppliers was the supplier of carpets. Another one was the supplier of carpets. In an airport, I tell you, in an airport, if you don't get your floorings right, you're stuffed. So we went through that thought process. And one of the most important things we did is we learned from our suppliers. They were a massive source of knowledge. And David might remember we issued an edict that in future, all meetings with suppliers will take place in their offices or their factories. We will never ask them to come to our office. And it was only by that we began to develop these relationships. And David will talk in a minute more about how we created relationships and agreements on these things. Third principle was that we had to completely rethink our approach to managing our project. Gary showed you the data, what was going on in more traditional projects. It was clear that you couldn't rely on traditional project management to coordinate a project on the scale of Terminal 5. So we decided we would have to take direct control of production and logistics in order to make all of this happen in the right way. And Todd will tell us more about how we did that. And the final principle, and I remember after I went along with John Egan to the BAA board and presented all of this, and they all agreed it. As I was just finishing, the chairman turned around to me and he said, by the way, he said, please don't practice on Terminal 5. He said, it's going to be another 4 or 5 years before we start building this thing. So go and practice now somewhere else. So we actually took over the existing £300 million a year infrastructure program at Heathrow Airport. And we used that to develop our own team, our supply chain, our methods, and really get really good at what we were doing, starting, funny enough, with a £12 million concrete multi-story car park. That was, David might remember the Genesis project, the famous, everybody's got a Genesis project, haven't they? And so while the rest of the team were getting permission through the planning process to build this thing, we were getting good at doing it. So Gary mentioned that other things grew out of Terminal 5. You know, while all this was going on, people were becoming aware of our approach and what we were doing. And in 1997, a new Labour government was elected in the UK. So it was still 2 or 3 years before we put a spade in the ground on T5. And the Deputy Prime Minister, the new Deputy Prime Minister, asked John Egan to chair a task force on the construction industry, because they were very worried that as they increased capital spending in the public sector, a lot of the money would be wasted. And John asked me to take 6 months off from my day job to support the task force. And we got all sorts of people, including Todd and some of you may know the famous Professor Dan Jones. We got him involved, all sorts of people got involved. And in 1998, we published Rethinking Construction, which I think Gary's mentioned. And I mean, I'll be honest, we didn't succeed in our ambition to transform the UK construction industry. But the ideas in this report and the concepts quickly gained currency, and they've had a significant influence amongst other owners. I mean, large areas of the water industry in the UK now follow these principles, and they've been developed. And more recently, the sort of developed version of those ideas has been published in a report in the UK from the Institute of Civil Engineers called Project 13, From Transactions to Enterprises. So that's a quick heads up on the background and how we did it, and I'll hand back to Gary.
Well, that's pretty deep. We could probably talk an hour on just this alone. So just a couple of quick questions for you. So BAA was privatized, correct?
Correct.
And so at the time they were launching this project, how easily would this terminal put BAA underwater?
Oh, easily. I mean, you know, if this, so for example, if we'd had the cost overrun they had on the Scottish Parliament, BAA would have been finished. It would have probably, well, there would have been some rescue, but effectively, the existing shareholders and board would have lost control of the company. You know, if you'd had that level, you know, the numbers here, this was singly the biggest investment BAA had ever made.
Yeah, so this was life-threatening.
Yeah, yeah. We weren't, you know, John wasn't joking when he said we could hold the company below the waterline.
Yeah. So when this got put in your lap, where did you start?
Well, you know, you start with your own people, and I inherited a really good team of people. And actually, what I found with people is that often in organizations, people know what they should be doing, or they know what could work, but they kind of feel constrained. There's a lovely expression I've heard people use here. If you want to get performance in an organization, you've got to put in the floors and take out the ceilings. And what that means is you've got to put secure floors beneath your staff so that they can actually begin to fly, and you've got to take out the ceilings above them. And I think most of the ideas were created within the organization and also through people being inspired by contact with other organizations. Yeah. You know, we've talked before about this, Gary, about the importance of curiosity in our business. And, you know, one of the questions, I had quite quickly after I joined the company, I worked directly for John Egan for nearly 4 years. And I used to have a fortnightly meeting with him, and every single meeting started with, where have you been? What have you seen?
Interesting. Curiosity is a key aspect of doing things in a different way. Wow, we could just go on for an hour, but unfortunately we can't. We're going to have to move on. You mentioned earlier that BAA as an owner instead of a client, and that resulted in a really different approach contractually. So let's move to our next panelist. David Hall played just an absolute vital role in creating this contractual environment for folks working on this project to be successful. So David, This agreement that you ended up with is kind of famous, and many point to it, or at least I think of it as the enabler for the innovation that occurred on T5. Tell us a little bit how it came about, how it worked, and what you learned from that.
Oh, Gary, thanks. Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's quite interesting because actually when I arrived at Terminal 5, I was a supplier. I wasn't BAA. And that almost illustrates, where Simon left this, that what BAA wanted to do was to engage with the capability that sat in their supply chain. And after a short while, I became seconded in. Eventually, I did change across to BAA. But actually, that's the reason it existed was because that door was opened by BAA. And what I was just I thought about long and hard about how I might do this, because the T5 agreement in 10 minutes is quite a challenge. But I thought I'd do it in 3 bits really, and the sketch on the whiteboard behind was bit my planning, but it was a bit the way that we structured the thinking around the T5 agreement as well, which was the start was really, where was the inspiration? What was in the toolbox that we wanted to use? Then what was the paradigm we wanted to create? And then finally, how did we engage with people on what that was? So I arrived at T5 in a tool bag, which I was my career up to there had been half on the supply side and half on the client side, doing sort of civils infrastructure type work on the supply side, and doing petrochem and exploration work in the North Sea on the client side. And I use the word side because in those days, a lot of the history, a lot of contracting approaches were very transactional, and quite a few were confrontational. And you picked your side. But after sort of 20 years of it, I sort of stood back and thought, actually, these are 2 sides of the same coin. They're not different sides, they're just different perspectives. And when I arrived at T5, one of the things that I thought that I could bring was how might these 2 perspectives join together to deliver success rather than fight each other. So that was a real starting point. And with that, I sort of had a toolkit of experience that I thought might be useful. Back in the 80s, I was working with Exxon Research and Engineering in the States, and they didn't spend a penny without producing a project execution plan at the start. And they planned everything, and they tied the contract strategy to the project execution plan. They tied it to the quality. They tied it to the objectives. They looked at where the vulnerabilities were, and so they set out their stall before they started. And that wasn't something that I had really seen. When I got into a project, the architect did his architecture stuff, the engineer did his engineer, everybody did their bit, but the grand plan was not missing. And then in the 80s, again, in my time with ESSO, we did 50% work in the North Sea with Shell. A tax break meant that if we could deliver a gas field a year earlier, there was a significant business income opportunity. So we decided that we would just try something different and see how it works. And we created something, a contracting strategy, in which I now think is used worldwide in quite a lot of situations, which we called EPIC, which was engineer, procure, install and commission, where we created at the very start of the project an integrated team who were all driven by a common objective in delivering a business outcome. It's less about building a platform and more about achieving a business outcome. And that's stuck in my mind for many a year. Alongside that, when I moved across to Bovis Lear McGovern, Bovis Program Management, and there they had very successful relationships with clients, serial relationships with clients, and serial backed up by serial relationships with suppliers, the supply chain. And through these serial relationships, like with Safeway, for example, over 2 or 3 years, they reduced the build of a new local headquarters from 32 months to 16 months, and still it's the same specifications, still to the same quality, just by having the serial relationship and working at removing the waste, removing the risks, removing the waste. Again, you know, all of this, as you can see, was starting to fit with the opportunities that BAA was looking to achieve. But alongside that technical stuff, I was also picking up and seeing the opportunity through behavioral indicators. In the early 90s, the North Sea was likewise challenged with cost and budget overruns. And a report came out, the Crine report, the cost reduction in a new era. I thought it was a fantastic name. But at least half of the report majored on the need for a cultural change. And this started for me to create a platform to level out the emphasis on the technical emphasis, to balance it with a behavioral emphasis. DuPont's behaviorals then introduced behavioral safety after a lot of chemical and petrochemical accidents as a way of trying to make inroads into the number of deaths being created in construction environments. Latham picked this up as well, and one of my team from Bovis worked alongside the Latham team, drawed on a lot of the cultural work that the Corps of Engineers have been doing in the US. And it was building a picture that cultures and values were as equally as important as scope and specification.
Sure.
And I think I arrived at T5 with this in the tool bag. And that Simon's described, BAA had created this fantastic environment, this opportunity, and really we felt empowered. I was privileged in the role I led the framework task force team that was buying out the latest frameworks. It was about £5 billion worth of expenditure over the following 5 years, including T5. And that sort of like gave an opportunity for the practicing work in the capital program, as well as setting it up right for Terminal 5. So that's how we got into it. And arriving at T5, there was a lot of conversation. Change is not easy. And even with Sir John waving the flag, I wouldn't say everybody was behind it. And there was a big discussion around evolution or revolution. And there was most were more comfortable with the evolutionary side. I think 3 things pushed me over the edge in terms of revolution. Let's go for revolution rather than evolution. I came across the Einstein's definition of insanity at this point in my life. I'm sure many people know it. It was new to me in those days. You know, doing the same thing twice and expecting a different result is a definition of insanity. So for me, that was the real point, was if you want to achieve something different, you've got to do something different.
Yeah.
And so we started to look around for a much more transformational type approach. And the Lean Construction Institute, I'm afraid, have some responsibility here as well, because I came across, either individually talking to people or through papers, the concept of the partnering patch and wicked problems. And the partnering patch really was that most contracting in those days, where partnering was starting to get a grip in the industry, but it was putting a patch over transactional relationships.
Yeah.
It wasn't trying to start with success. It was trying to minimize the effect of blame. So that was one pivotal line of thinking that came in. And the second one was around wicked problems, that mega projects, mega challenges aren't solved by just scaling up conventional approaches.
Yeah.
And most of the contracting approaches and delivery approaches were still based on scaling up. Classic Gantt chart, waterfall type approaches, segmented, do a concept design, do a detailed design, procure, and then construct. And actually, that wasn't going to be appropriate. So those really set the scene for the thinking needed to be in terms of a paradigm shift rather than just tweaking what we had.
Yeah.
And out of that really came the building blocks of the thinking around the T5 agreement. And I'd summarize it as 3 sets of principles. The first was rather than to write a contract, it was to set out a delivery strategy, an operating model.
Mm-hmm.
That encompassed a lot of those things that Simon was just talking about, and a few more. The particular start of it was to try and start from the end and look backwards to what would you need to do to be successful, recognizing that this was going to be 8 to 10 years before the first customers were going to be going through. And in that time, there's going to be so many changes of people, changes of technology. When we first started Terminal 5, everybody used to buy their ticket at the terminal. By the time it was opened, only 2% of tickets were issued in the terminal. Everything else was built online. The internet didn't exist when the original concepts. So the whole concept of a terminal changed, and that had to be accommodated. So what we ended up with was, rather than writing terms and conditions, we rolled it back to principles and structure.
Yeah.
And that required a lot of discussion, and it required a lot of forward looking. It required a lot of input. One of the real values of concurrent with heading up T5's procurement activity, I was also heading up the framework activity. And so it was a good opportunity to get feedback and input from suppliers, as talked about, that Simon's already referred to. And we set up quite a lot of forums to pull this learning and history from outside of standard UK construction to petrochem and the motor industries and the like as well. And within that delivery strategy and that time length, we really made 2 big differences, two decisions around it being different. One was that the commercial arrangements would be progressive, not set at the start. So just the elements, the commercial elements were set at the start, but the actual mechanisms and the payments and the agreement of on whether you fixed or reimbursed would occur over time as you knew more. And the same situation with risks. A lot of the learning that we had was that when people try and pre-think through risks and pre-assign them, they mostly get it wrong. And if you get it wrong, you pay one way or another. You either pay in time or you pay in cost pounds and dollars, and quite often you pay both ways. And in that process, you also put people's lives at risk, and you certainly put the quality at risk. So that was the one of the two of the big change elements in how we underpin doing the physical work, was by changing the approach around the risk and the commercial side. The second thing that we did within, so this wasn't something that went in the bottom drawer. The whole design of this was it would sit on your desk, and that's the reason it got the word handbook attached to it at for quite a period. The second principle was, which I've already alluded to, was being much more outcome driven rather than task driven, roles and tasks, and trying to be customer led. And at that time, the concept of the customer wasn't really well enacted, because from the airport's point of view, there were two customers. There was the client, the eventual client, who was British Airways, but actually the airport owned the passenger for a great length of their journey through the terminal. And one of the person I certainly admired at the time was Raymond Turner, the design director, who, for me, he absolutely got it on his head. Unfortunately, I think most people didn't get it, and they thought it was a load of rubbish, but I thought it was inspirational, where he stopped calling it, he said, stop thinking about it as a terminal, which is like the end of the road, and start thinking about it as the experience. And he came up with this phrase, most refreshing experience, because actually that's what you want. You want to go through the terminal is part of your journey, and you want to be refreshed rather than it just being something. You're not bloody going through Terminal 5 again. So you wanted the opposite. And so we took this down into the way that we things set out, and said that's actually where we need to start. The relationships with British Airways weren't good.
David, I hate to have to do this to you. We're going to have to move on and see how this played out. With
I knew this was going to be a challenge of doing it in 10 minutes.
That was very enlightening. I love those principles. I love the idea of start with looking back and say, what paradigm do we need to get a different outcome? That is really brilliant. I think we could take that to any project today, anywhere. So our next speaker is Ed McCann. Ed had the engineering, responsible for engineering with anything to do with water. So Ed, can you turn on your camera? Hope Ed's there. There he is. And I think you're going to share some slides with us.
Yes, I'm just going to start. Yeah, so thanks very much, Gary. Yes, yeah, interesting listening to the generals talk about the battle. Back in '99, when I joined the project, I was definitely a sort of NCO, and I confess I didn't pay much attention to the T5 framework. I'm not sure I knew about it very much. I was sent out there. I'd been, it was about 10 years postgraduate. I'd been working as a design engineer. I just finished 2 years on site. and got back in the office, and I got lobbed out to Terminal 5, which was described as a really challenging, interesting project and all the rest of it. And as you do when you're 30 years old, you just do what you're told. And so I did. So I went off out to Terminal 5. And what I'm going to do in my little 10-minute slide is I'm going to paint a picture of what it was like for us there, and how this grand strategy that you've heard Simon and David outline actually turned into effect on the ground, because it really, really did. And with another 25 years on since I started on Terminal 5, I can say with absolute confidence one of the two best programs I've ever worked on in my life by a country mile. Anyway, so so I turned up there as I went out as the deputy head, but fairly rapidly my boss moved on, so I became the what was called the task team leader for the water engineering team. We turned up and in an environment which was quite different for us. So it was an integrated project team. There were about, I think, 250, 300 of us in an office at Heathrow. Yeah. And we were all used to working in our own offices with our own teams of people, and you went to meetings in client offices, and here we were, and you couldn't tell who anybody worked for you. I was sitting next to people from contractors. We were in a big open plan floor space. Everybody's, unbadged. No one knew who you worked for. You knew you were the water engineering team. They were the civil, they were the pavement team, they were the building team, but we didn't know what companies we came from. And I rapidly realized that my bosses were actually BAA people, that my boss wasn't my company boss anymore. I was literally dealing with people from BAA. And a lot of the unsung heroes from my point of view on T5 were people like Bob Lane and John Harden, who were BAA engineers. They were technical engineers. They understood how to build stuff, how to run standards, how to do ops. They were all lifers. They'd all been in BAA for decades, and they were our bosses. And if we wanted to do well, we had to impress our bosses, and our bosses were our clients. These are very odd circumstance. There was a complete direct line of sight. They could see right into their supply chain. They could see who was trying, who was good, who was rubbish. They could intervene to say, do you know what? We don't want them anymore. We'll have more of those, please. And so we were actively managed by people who understood what we were trying to achieve. And that was really, really important. So co-location, unbadging, technical engineers leading the project on behalf of BAA, not project managers without a clue about technical matters, technical risk management, ops, or anything else. And I'll come on to just a couple of points, then I'll show you a couple of examples of what happens as a result. Is one of the key things I did understand was that we were not carrying risk in the way that we normally did, that BAA were going to own technical risk. But what we had to do was to talk to them about what technical risk was and manage our way through it by eliminating it as risk. And I'll show you a couple of examples how we did that. The other thing to say is, how did they get it on budget? Well, the way they got it on budget was by battling cost escalation on a continuous basis. We were always fighting down cost escalation. We were always coming up with ways of trying to stop cost escalation, which is what actually happens on projects, is that cost escalation happens because everyone's forgotten about stuff. Scope creeps in, or technical risk appears that you hadn't thought about. And so we were, although I'm not sure I can claim that we saved money over the budget, I can tell you we saved fortunes compared to what the outturn cost would have been if we hadn't continually battled stuff down. And again, I'm going to show you a couple of slides that talk about that. And so what it felt like to us was it felt very novel. We were co-located into this office. We were working directly for our clients. They were technical folk, technical engineers, and we all knew that we were trying to battle cost by managing technical risk. So I'll share a couple of slides with you here, if that's okay. Bear with me, share screen. And you might, it might be a bit of a surprise to people to realize that when Terminal 5 was going on, when you added in the relocation of the Perry Oak sewage treatment works, the diversion of rivers and all the other stuff was going on, it was actually the biggest water engineering project in the UK by capital value in that period, which is a bit surprising given it was an airport expansion. And for those of you who don't know much about airfields and water engineering, there's a lot of systems, from potable water, non-potable water, fuel farm, firefighting, airfield firefighting, foul drainage, pollution control, surface water drainage, roof drainage, blah, 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 blah. And this was the remit that we had in the water engineering team. I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 of these, if time permits. The biggest pollution issue you had.
So Ed, we're not seeing your screen.
Oh, you're not?
Yeah.
So what's gone on there then? So I tried sharing, it didn't work. Let's go again. Is that sharing?
It looks like there we got it now. Good.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I said it was quite a chunky project in UK water engineering terms. 70 million. The team I ran and John Sweetman took over for me after 4 years. It got to about 25 people, so not a huge team. And 70 million construction cost was the sort of number when I was around. I'm sure we spent more than that in the end, but still. A significant chunk. These were all the systems that we were responsible within the water engineering. So you had to organize yourself around these different systems. It was a very systems-based design approach. You mentioned earlier organizing around systems in delivering lean, and that was certainly what we were doing. Pollution control was one of these systems. The biggest pollutant on airfields, there are two. One of them is hydrocarbons, so it's people filling up tanks and overfilling. In the day, the pilots never want to fly empty, so they basically fill. In this era, they used to stuff the fuel in, and they knew it was full when it started squirting back out on them. And if they got distracted, then quite a lot squirted back out onto the airfield stands. And so you had to go out and clean up the mess. But the other one, and the one that is particularly problematic at Heathrow, is glycol, a de-icing you spray on planes. In the US, people will be familiar. They normally contain these. There's special areas where you de-ice planes. In the UK, we don't. It's not cold enough to warrant that. So we use extensive de-icing. We de-ice on stands, which means this stuff goes everywhere. And the particular issue about this is you don't realize, but all of this stuff ends up in local rivers and ends up killing fish. And so we have a strong regulatory environment in the UK said we're not allowed to do this. But when we got involved in this, no one really knew what happened to this stuff. They knew how much stuff was put on planes, but they didn't know if it fell off on the stands or on the taxiways, or it left on the runways, or if it went off into the sky with the planes and fell off in the nearest towns. We didn't know what happened to this stuff when it sat on the ground, because it didn't rain straight away, it was frozen. And so does this stuff degrade? What happens to it, and how does it hit the river system? And so what we did at T5 was, because we could have this conversation with these engineers, these technical engineers, and say, by the way, you're going to spend 50 million quid on reservoirs, pollution interceptors, blah, 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 to deal with this stuff. If we can understand it better, then we can halve the size of the infrastructure you need to do this. And so do you want to do that? And so we developed on T5 this, at the time, absolutely groundbreaking stuff around what happens with this. We built computational models. We went into laboratories and we measured the degradation of glycol sitting in frozen conditions. And we went out onto airfields. We put tarpaulins down, sprayed glycol on planes to see how much fell off it. And so we were doing raw science, building models, validating models, and this allowed us to reduce the size of the pollution control infrastructure to a huge degree, 30–40% plus reductions in the total scale of infrastructure, because the client was investing in this R&D to reduce risk and reduce the amount that we were doing. I've never had the opportunity to do this sort of stuff on any project with any client ever since this.
Oh, that's brilliant.
They took that modeling that we developed and we used it across those other 6 airfields in the 7 airfield pack. And so they were gaining on every single one of them. They were either proving they didn't need to do stuff, or they were minimizing the amount of investment they need to make to do it. Second one, birds and bird balls. Some of you will know that birds and aeroplanes, particularly when they're taking off and landing, don't go well together. Heathrow is a water park viewed from the sky. It's in the Thames Valley. It's surrounded by rivers and lakes and reservoirs and all the rest of it. And so bird suppression or control is very, very important. At Heathrow, we found that there was this technique that had been developed in the US on tailing dams, which used floating plastic balls. And we decided we were going to use loads of them. We ended up buying millions of the things and putting them in lagoons and across the patch. But we couldn't just use them, because there's something when airplanes take off, there's something called a vortex downstrike. So what happens is they'll lift stuff up off the ground. And so the last thing we needed was these things flying around all over the place. So we created special balls. They're half filled with water so that they can't be sucked up by vortex downdraft or blown out of these environments onto the runways.
Yeah.
And we went into laboratories again. We did wind tunnel tests. We imported them. We tested them. We did all this sort of stuff. And again, saved millions, because these things would have had to be covered. All of these lagoons that we had associated with the water engineering on the airfield would have had to have permanent covers over the top of them, big metal structures. So we got rid of that. And then the final one is on roof drainage. It's a 6-hectare roof. So it's 60,000 square meters of roof on top of on the principal building at Terminal 5. And at the time, the building services engineers, they don't really understand dam hydraulics and the sort of big stuff. They like 6-inch pipes, and they like little vortex clackers and things that sit on top of gutters that you see on your house. And the architects didn't want that at all. And so in this project, it didn't matter that we were meant to be doing the stuff in the ground and there was someone else doing the terminal building. The architect said, we don't want all of those downpipes. If you ever go to Terminal 5 and look up, you're going to see these. That thing running around the top is a 1.3 meter wide, meter deep gutter that runs the entire length of either side of the building. And it's collected into these hoppers, which let the water fall, accelerate, and then get into these 2 tiny pipes. But I give that as an example because what happened on Terminal 5 was the work went to the people who were best qualified and comfortable to do it and who could manage the risk. Because the client was in the room, they knew who that was. And so it was absolutely fine. The building services engineers were delighted that my team took this on because we could do it and it would have blown their minds. That wasn't what a building services company was used to doing. And we, at the company I worked for at the time, they did dams and reservoirs and all this sort of stuff. This sort of stuff wasn't worrying to them at all. And the client at Terminal 5 could tell the difference and would distribute the work in accordance to capability in managing risk. So anyway, look, I'll shut up there. I know we're pressurized for time, but hopefully you get an idea that how what David and Simon were talking about, what they tried to create, really did have effect. By no means were we the only team doing this. The pavement teams were doing this, the building teams were doing it, tunneling teams were doing it. They were all trying with their technically focused clients to minimize risk, battle down costs, and do this sort of fundamental research that was necessary to do good stuff on the airport.
And it sounds like a key enabler of that is BA took the risk.
It was critical. It was critical.
So that you didn't have to put in all this extra conservatism just in case, which always costs more money. You were able to go after that and dial the design right down to what was needed for the application.
And that working collaborative around risk, they could understand whether what we were doing was actually controlling risk or not. These were technical engineers. They understood the arguments. It wasn't somebody hiding behind a contract going, sounds scary. They were putting their technical judgment in line with ours, and we were coming to collective views on what the real problems were. And that saved fortunes. In my team, we were making call after call that was saving millions of pounds because the client could understand that, yes, no, this is an appropriate risk position, whether it was firefighting or it was pollution control. And our regulator got on board with it as well because we lined up together and said, look at all the work we've done to show how this will work.
Yeah.
Now, where do we go?
Wow. Again, we could talk for a whole hour about this, but you've given our audience some really good meat, things to think about and the application of their work. So let's turn to our last panelist, Todd Zabel. Todd, you were a member of the demand fulfillment team involved in the production aspects of this, engineering through fabrication. What you did was absolutely vital for the success of this project, given all the constraints of in and out. And so tell us about that. Tell us about the approach and what you did and how it worked out.
You can see the screen all right?
Not yet.
Okay. I have a unique situation that I've never experienced before, and that is there's a fire alarm going off here at One Maritime, but they do this on a regular basis, so we're going to hang tight for a while. But you can see the screen now?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
It's the regular presentation mode, right? Okay, so I'm going to go through this really quick. I can't say enough about how much of an honor it was to work at T5 and to work alongside people that you've heard from so far today. It was an incredible experience, and yes, we were involved in what was called demand fulfillment. But think about that as the fulfillment of information, materials, and equipment to the site, and along with labor, and to make all that work. I would suggest you get your hands on the T5 agreement that Simon facilitated and David wrote. It's an incredible document, and it really does lay out a framework. And what's interesting is how we're not going to work. I think it was important to understand, and I remember Simon would invite us to dinners with John Egan, the people working on T5, and you'd say, hey, I'm a car man, and there really are no limits on where we want to go here as to what we're trying to do. If you came back to him and said, hey, this is the way we do it in construction, he would have none of it, right? So he knew about some of the things that I'm going to show you that we were allowed to do. The remit was very simple for our team from a strategic level: get the right information, materials, equipment, labor at the right quantity, the right place at the right time, every time. That was the overarching element. And then it got very specific on what that meant, right? I can make this available to people afterwards, but there was a lot of thinking on BAA's part, especially guys like John Harden and Bob Lane, at that particular time, and later Russell Batchelor and others that were our customers as we moved through the phases of the construction part of the project. These were very, very sharp people. They knew what they were doing, and they talked in questions and objectives, right? And fabulous people that really challenge you. I'm going to show you some stuff that some of you probably will say that can't be done, even though we're already doing it. But some amazing things occurred as Ed had mentioned. So really, the way we looked at this was how do we go define, design, deploy, and improve a production system for the project, right? And we start off by looking at what is the scope from a schedule perspective, because that was fairly developed at the time, and it's been ingrained in us that it's 80 by 08, 80 milestones by 2008. For a while there was 70 by 07, and then they made some changes, but it became 80 by 08. And today anyone on T5 would know 80 by 08. I'm sure Dave and Ned are smiling now, because 80 by 08 was just everywhere. So some metrics that I think are really important, and we went out to map this situation and to define the problem. As part of the planning inquiry, BA agreed to not allow any deliveries between 7 and 9 a.m. and 4 and 6 p.m. every day. And there was a delivery that occurred every 30 seconds through a single road with one point of entrance and egress. The storage on site equaled 1 day or less. Okay, so we weren't going to drag all the stuff out there. And the majority of the work occurred after 9/11. So think about 100 tower cranes out there and operating runways on both sides. And one of the strategies by the Ministry of Defense was to change the routing of the planes coming in. So we would start, we would stop, we would start, we would stop, but there's deliveries coming in every 30 seconds, right? And here's another view of the complexity that David and Ed were talking about. Some of the demand, right? So we went out, we mapped the demand. That was incredible, because at the time, no one had ever done that. But per day, the project in the civil portion was going to consume 5,000 tons of aggregate, 650 tons of Portland cement. And you can see the rest there, 113 tons of pre-assembled rebar. Okay, I believe the offsite portion of the civil work was above 80%. Okay, now I'm going back over 20 years ago, right? Maybe more. We did a lot of modeling and mapping of the value streams and the supply chains that fed this. The work that David did and Simon did was groundbreaking. There was no resistance when we went in to go see people to do this work. They participated in this work. So that was a really important part. And then they learned a lot about, hey, I'm down here, maybe way back here fabricating rebar. I never really understood what might happen over here, right? So what we basically concluded is there was large inventories throughout the supply chain. The majority of made to stock stuff was produced to forecast. So the guy making aggregate, T5, as big as it was, I think T5 was 2% of his business. He was like, hey, I just make it to a forecast. It's here. Give me a call when you need it. And then the ETO stuff, there was a number of suppliers that hadn't fully got on the program yet, and they were trying to figure out ways to get money and create long lead, and we addressed that. So really the strategy was to reduce variability. When you start talking about moving stuff in over the roads, 9/11, the complexity of the site and all, you're dealing with a lot of variability. And I'm sure everyone on this call knows is there's variability. You're either going to lose time or you're going to have costs go up, right? So one of the things that we came up with, and this is very, very, very contrary to construction, is to use capacity buffers rather than inventory. So let me translate that. We wanted people and equipment waiting, not material.
Wow. People
and equipment waiting, not material. Now, when you only have 1 day of laydown on site, it's pretty simple to do that, right? But this is something, and when you're dealing with people that come out of the car industry, and the guy that ended up taking over the project after a while, Tony Douglas, he was John Egan's car man, right? They got this, right? So there's a trade-off between capacity, labor, equipment, space, and inventory. And again, it was capacity, people and equipment waiting over materials waiting, right? That was one of the key things that happened here that contribute to the success. And then controlling the amount of WIP, all right? So there was detailed production rules. We don't need to go through all these, but basically use consolidation centers to shield the site from the over-road variability, plan for every part, deliver today what we install tomorrow. If it didn't get consumed, take it out. So we were backhauling stuff back out, right? We were back flushing the system, if you will, right? Return assembly packages that cannot be installed, right? We'll talk a little bit about the marketplaces. So basically a lot of effort in computer-aided production engineering, and that being done concurrently, physical controls, and then the use of what was called project flow on the project. And I'll go through this really quick, and then we'll wrap it up. This is really interesting. The design of the substructure for the T5A building and all the other stuff as well, but this is an example of that, and the piles and the machines in factory that were going to make those piles all simultaneously, concurrently, all right? So not only what has to be done, but how is it going to be done? So Ed talked about this co-located thing. You didn't really say what company you were with. You were just on a team, right? And so we would start to facilitate these sessions because we were involved in the design of this facility to make the rebar cages. And what we were trying to understand is what's the demand and what's coming through this place, right? And so we would go talk with people that were very happy to share this. And then we ended up bringing in, as part of the demand fulfillment team, some high-end computer modeling back then. These are basically silicon graphics computers we were running with some pretty advanced 3D to get to this level of detail, all right? From a logistics perspective, again, logistics centers, everything flowed through logistics centers because the idea was to shield the site from variability of over-the-road traffic and the rest. Anybody that moved between a logistics center and the site, Will, you're out there listening after dinner last night, they had authorization to move in and out of the site and within this zone. So it's basically quarantined, all right? And so what we didn't want were people that were new drivers showing up, that roaming around out there that didn't know what they were doing. Things got delivered to the logistics center, they spent the night there, and then they were brought in, okay? But the logistics centers were a lot more. They were the rebar shop, the largest rebar fabrication shop in Europe at the time, okay? And producing some of the most expensive rebar ever produced in Europe. But that was a localized thing versus the gains that were made for the whole, okay? Purposely built, I don't remember the number, it was either 50 or 80 million pounds for the facility for the project 1 and 2, okay? All right, this might make you shake your head. One of the things that we wanted to do, going back to the diagram, is we wanted to be able to pull the fabrication of rebar just in time. This was not a scary thing to the carmen. Of course, that's what you're going to do. How would you do it any other way? So we came up with how we might do that. The problem was it would take 6 weeks to go from let's call it a detailed engineering element that got us down to a BOM to something would be installed. We took an hour before lunch, mapped this out. Again, we went and found guys like Ed. Hey, can you come and join us? We're buying pizzas through the demand fulfillment, our little budget. And we got back together after lunch, and we were able to get a 6-week process down to 5 days, okay? That allowed us to pull. So what did that 5 days look like? Well, we had spent time coming up with standard designs for things. And then what would happen is people from, I believe this was Mott McDonald at the time, and some of the guys from the Civil Works team, they would take and develop sketches, and they would stamp the sketches, okay? Like, why do we need to make all these drawings? That would automatically go into the 3D model that would be sent down to the fabrication shop that would put into what we call assembly packages, because work packages we're using under the project management term, delivered to the site, and the whole thing took somewhere between 5 and 7 days.
Wow.
All right.
So Todd, that left-hand side, was that your biggest gain in the schedule, is how to get that engineering done and stamp drawings or sketches?
I think it all was, right? So it was and let me put a little more voodoo on this, right?
Okay.
But again, guys working at tables, and so what you typically see is somebody, a detailer does a drawing, it goes back to the structural guy to approve it, for a guy to put it in a 3D model, for the structural guy to look at it, to come back down to the contractor to do something with it. And that's really what was going on, and all this back and forth and all these different systems and so on and so forth. And the mock guys are like, hey, we're happy to do a sketch and stamp it. We got no problem with that, right? No one's ever asked us that, but back in the old days, we had one of those graybeards that said, back in the old days, I used to be out on site doing that, right? And we kind of lost the plot, as some of you guys that are my age or older would know. We took advantage of immersive reality, so we went into immersive reality centers. We had people in there that were rebar fixers or iron workers or rebar benders here in the U.S. And they sat in there with the structural engineer, and they would look at things like, look, I can't pull a 50 millimeter bar through there, but give me 5 10s or 10 5s or something. And these guys were doing the design to get to exactly what needed to happen using immersive reality. It was incredible to watch them, right? And a structural engineer talking to a foreman, and both them saying to each other, I never knew that. Oh, really? Oh, I never knew that. And it was spectacular. Coming back to this idea of the con whip, again, using, let's say, the rebar, the schedule, the production schedule was for the installation, and everybody upstream was a slave. There was no schedule for fabrication, assembly, delivery. There was no schedule for the detailed engineering I showed you in the picture. There was one schedule. It was the site. And as if this was a hydraulic system, everything was a slave to it. All right. This is called a con whip version of pool control, right? And so all we had to do is schedule the work on site, and then that would send the signal. And that was done through a software application, again, called Project Flow for the project. That was one of the things that we developed. I'm going to give you one more example, and then I'll hand it back. This was very interesting. In the beginning, there was going to be 7 what was called marketplaces, and marketplaces would be somewhere where craft guys would go and be able to get hard hats and spanners or wrenches, hammers, whatever stuff they needed, right? And when the site got modeled, it got down to 1, S1, right? Site store 1. And so somehow we had to figure out how we're going to make that happen. And basically put your tools to work. What is that production system? Let's map it and let's figure out what to go do. And one of the things that we did, which was pretty profound at the time, is we bifurcated the commercial part of this from the actual physical flows. And what I mean by that was there was blanket purchase orders given to the various suppliers, right, with a maximum purchasing limit by whoever was involved in the site store doing purchasing. But a purchase order was not the signal to ship something. A purchase order was the signal to transact. And I think this is what Dave was talking about, a relational contract that says, this is how we're going to operate, and we're going to put, I don't know, $1 million on a blanket purchase order to you. Okay. We want to see the invoices regularly, but that has nothing to do with what we're picking up. Okay. We don't need you to take any action. We're just telling you this is what we're going to do. And basically what happened was a milk run. A better way to understand this is there was stuff at the site, okay, that was stored in bins. The driver would literally go on a milk run around town, and town was, could have been a 100-mile radius or whatever, pick stuff up. And the rule for the supplier was when we send a bin in, it's empty, fill it and let it sit. So there was 2 bins at the site, maybe 2 bins at the supplier, maybe 2, depending on what the situation is, in transit, or 1, and just went around in a milk run. And I'll leave you with this. Just that was able to take the cycle time to 2 or 3 hours a day for same day delivery, 1 day of stock, 98% of reliability if you went in to get something, supplying more than 800 different selective products with up to 1,200 orders a day. So this little site store was doing $180,000 a month, and those dollars of just supplying stuff to the project. Okay. Wow. So I'll hand it back with that, if I may.
Well, I could have 1,000 questions for you, Todd. That was really insightful. And I really like the point you made about people are waiting on, instead of the equipment waiting on people, people waiting on equipment. That is really counterintuitive, but really, really, really insightful. That's good stuff. So I want to reserve a little bit of time for audience questions here. We've had a few come in, but we can open it up. You can just ask a question verbally, or you can come into the chat and ask a question. So we'll just open it up for the audience now. Anybody?
Well, I'd like to know when the Brits started wearing. I know Ed's always got a t-shirt on, but Simon with a hoodie, that was a new look.
Yeah, bet he wasn't doing that with Sir Edward Egan. Okay, what did you not do but would have liked to have done? Great question. Anybody want to take a shot at that one?
My starter on that one was, which I think we learnt the hard way, was whilst we took an end-to-end approach right from very early concept right through to commissioning, we probably didn't pay enough attention to operational integration. And it's bit us on the day. And we learned that. And when we did T2 and things like that, it was a lot more smoother. But certainly that tail end interface of the project process.
Ed? Yeah, you're on mute, Ed.
Yeah, the big regret I have about T5 is we didn't realize quite how special it was when we were doing it. And actually, because the projects I worked on the London Olympics. I worked on a lot of sort of projects around the world, and 20 years on, I'm still looking back on it and going, that in terms of a way of dealing with complex projects, I've not seen better. And I just don't think at the time we appreciated it. It was new, it was novel, we're doing stuff. We moaned away about things we didn't like about it, but actually it was really, really quite special. And we should, afterwards, we got better at learning legacy. Projects like the Olympic, we wrote entire libraries of crap about the Olympics and Crossrail and all the rest of it. And as far as I know, nothing like that was done on Terminal 5. And it was a project that deserved it more than most. So my big regret on Terminal 5 is I feel like we lost a generation, actually. It was a high point in how certainly the UK, although it was an international project, it got itself together and worked in quite interesting ways. And we haven't, I think, really understood all of the lessons out of T5. Somebody needs to look at it properly. And one of the things I would say, and I mention it repeatedly in mine, is the importance of technically knowledgeable clients who can understand what they're being told and challenge it from a technical risk perspective, and all the stuff Todd's talking about as well. The client had to understand that. You can't invest in this stuff unless you understand it. And this was a client who had enough people around the table who genuinely understood the processes we were trying to do and the risks we were trying to manage. And I really struggled to think of examples, certainly in UK infrastructure projects, where you have clients with that level of technical understanding of the processes of construction and design.
Yeah, I think it's a common problem, not limited to the UK. Yeah, Simon.
The thing I wish we'd done is actually right at the beginning engaged more actively with our customer, which was British Airways. And it really picks up what David was saying about operational integration, operational readiness. I think one of the people may remember that on the day T5 opened, there were all sorts of problems with people losing their bags and all the rest of it. And the sort of story that came out was that the baggage system didn't work. It was a kind of Denver story, but that wasn't, the baggage system worked perfectly. It's just that we hadn't really integrated British Airways, who had to operate the baggage system, or operate at least, take the bags out of the aircraft and put the bags in, all that. They hadn't really been integrated in the system. So I think I would have spent far more time up front, particularly working with the BAA board and John Egan, on what is the overall governance structure for this. We tend to create our governance structure as a project rather than as an entity that represented the entire airport community.
So we got a great question here about, says, great point about starting with success. How easy or difficult was it to align all the key people at BAA on the definition of success? How did you create a common definition of success? David, you want to take a shot at that to begin with?
Well, from my perspective, at one level, we didn't try too hard because we actually knew that where we would end up would be somewhere different from where we started. So that's the reason we put in place the principles of working together so we could address things as they emerged. I think Errol Smith was in charge at the time, and his big word was dealing with ambiguity. And that became a premise that you built ambiguity into part of your process. And as Ed has illustrated so well, it was all about having the right people round the table in order to make the best decision and to mitigate the risks and the impacts rather than just assign them. So it's one of the challenges of the agreement in terms of accepting it. People will just say, well, prove to me that it's going to work. Well, when you're trying to innovate with something that's not been done, you can't. You've actually just got to trust. And I think that was a big challenge for people to accept.
Ed?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because what's interesting is that I think I might have been the only part of an organization that was actually bought in, who were procured. Was anyone else procured? So we were on the other side of that, David. And I was, as I say, I was quite junior at the time, so I came in after that. But they told the stories of the interviews, and it was really odd because you turned up and it was essentially a 0 hours contract. Because you would go through this whole palaver to get picked, and then you'd say, how big's the job? And say, we don't know. We're going to get in a room and decide what the job is. And it really blew their minds. All of the, I worked for a very good consultancy who came back and said, I don't know whether this is a £10,000 job or a £10 million job. What is, and it took a while and not everybody got it. I think some of the consultants, certainly speaking for the consultant fraternity, never really understood the idea. And I think the company that I worked for at the time, they got it in the end. They got it that what you had to do was turn up with your best people. And that was what they understood in the end, is turn up with your best people and then work with these guys to sort of try and help them realize their dream. And if you do that, then everything will be fine. And it was, because they gave you more work and they looked after you and they took the risks. And it was one of the huge challenges we have is driving performance through contracts in our industry. And the genius of Terminal 5 is it gave people what they needed, which was more work. If you were good, you got more work. There was you didn't get bonuses. You didn't get a sort of like a profit enhancer. Well, certainly we didn't. And actually we weren't very interested in it. What we were interested in was more interesting work on an ongoing basis. If you turned up with good people, you did good stuff, you made your clients smile, you got more work. And I look around and I go, who's doing this? Who understands that the supply chain needs continuity of work far more than it needs an extra bonus on a particular, stop and finish project? I don't know, Simon and David, how clear you were on that when you dreamt this thing up, but as a lived experience, that's what we realized when we got inside it, was that work flowed to you if you were good. If you put good people in a room, work flowed to you. And if you didn't, there was no work. It wasn't
probably have a lot of,
good, you get zero.
That was kind of part of it.
In the audience nodding on that one. Simon?
Yeah, that was kind of part of it. But actually, the answer that I would give to this question is a much deeper recognition right up front, and it wasn't my idea. We had a most amazing corporate affairs director in BAA, Des Wilson, who was a tough New Zealander who had actually worked in the charitable world, and it was an inspired appointment by John Egan. He didn't look anything like BAA. He was a passionate cricketer, came from charitable work. He was well known in the environmental movement, and right early on, Des took me out to lunch and he said to me, I've been watching what you're doing. It's fascinating. He said, you have the biggest communication problem in the company. And he said, you need help. I don't have the staff to do it, but I will talk to John Egan and we will find budget, and you need to go and find yourself a grade 1 communications team, which is what we did. And we went out and we hired this company entirely staffed by very experienced women, 3 directors. They just set up their own company. And it was them that constantly reminded us of these kind of issues about communicating. It was them that said, have you thought how this looks to, they didn't say Ed McCann, but have you thought how this looks to a consultant? Have you thought about how you know, how you get this idea across to your own colleagues. I mean, I'll give you one example. One of the very early things we did, when we looked at our existing program, every single project was run with a different process. You had, you know, each contractor had their own process. You had the RIBA process, you name it, we had. So we said, no, we're going to have the BAA project process. So we spent about 6 months developing it, and then we were going to launch it. And our communications people said to us, they said, in a big company like this, everybody will nod sagely, and as soon as it's out there, they'll start undermining you. So the solution to this, we recognized that, we used to have an expression we developed with them, everybody has got to have their fingerprints on this, everybody in the company. And everybody in British Airways has got to have their fingerprints on it. So they said they don't know of any guy who can ever resist an attractive person on a television camera. So we hired this television lady, and we went all around the airports and around British Airways and everybody and filmed them and said, what do you think about the BAA project process? Well, they're on camera. They said, it's terrific. It's wonderful. I really want it, kind of thing. And then we put it into a film. And I said to my team, the last thing we're having is me in this film. We had John in the introduction. And then I think we made 10,000 copies of it, or some huge number of copies. Of it. And we gave one to everybody, you know, or at least 1,000 copies, I think it was. And of course, then they couldn't back off from it at that point. They were in the film.
They were committed.
The project process is rubbish. You know, they were recording saying it was brilliant. So it's things like that I would never, me and my team would never have had the insight to be able to think through in terms of communicating. And I think probably in the end, communication was the difference in T5.
Well said. Todd, you want to add anything to all that?
No, I have one thing I'd like to show real quick that people might want to go find. I found this in preparing some stuff. This is hopefully you can see the screen. This was I don't know why, but for some reason, UC Berkeley did an analysis on the project, and it pretty much lays out much of what was talked about today. And so for the people that are interested, maybe you could take a screenshot and go find this. I just happened to find it on my computer when I was looking around for something, but yeah, I think that, you know, T5 is a very special situation, and there was experiences there that were interesting. I remember there was a guy, I can't remember his name. He had been on the project for many years, and there was a little shop in there that David and Ed would remember. That guy made baguettes, and this guy just couldn't eat another baguette. I mean, the guy snapped one day and said, I can't eat any more baguettes. We had a boss, as Ed would say, one of our bosses had a meltdown, literally had a nervous breakdown in front of Roberto and I one night. And we said, what do we do now? Our boss just, you know, basically took him out in an ambulance, and I don't know, he had some personal problems, whatever. And we just said, we marshal on. We went to see, I think it was Jordan Hart at the time, and said, John, the guy melted down. What do we do? He said, what do you mean? You carry on. So it was very interesting, where you just did whatever was the right thing. And it was almost self-policing. If you did something wrong, people let you know. That's not what we're here to do. And I got to say, and Simon and David were brilliant in this. If you weren't with the program, they just took you hunting. You got invited out and you didn't come back. There was no boss telling you can't be here. Somebody who worked alongside would just say, you're done. You're out, right? As McKinsey called it, you're counseled to leave by your peers. There was no review or whatever. If you showed up, put your company logo up, and you had things with your company logo, like you'd say, who's that guy work? Who does he work for? Who does she work for? You don't even know, right?
Yeah.
You work for T5.
Well, what you all have laid out here is an incredible recipe for success for any project, and a mega project for sure. I got one last question. What prevented this approach from taking fire, you know, and spreading, particularly through the UK, but beyond? Like, what happened?
Maybe that's a question for you, Gary, sitting on a $40 billion CapEx budget at Chevron. What, I mean, seriously, right?
Yeah. You know, for me personally, it was not understanding this. And I'm sitting here thinking, holy cow, why didn't I do a deep dive into T5 to understand that when we were designing Chevron's project management system? We would have done something totally different. I was just out of ignorance or laziness and not looking under the right rocks.
Maybe I can have a crack at this, Gary. I think it's something that's sort of I've thought about a lot in the last 20 years. I think one of the things that we should recognize, and a bit of context I didn't talk about, was if you go back to that period, the kind of neoliberal ideas that have come out of, you know, the economists in Chicago and all the rest of, you know, Milton Friedman and people like that, really had taken a deep hold on the psyche of companies and governments. Deep in the psyche was this idea that you got a result by outsourcing, by driving down costs, by putting pressure on people. And I suppose that core kind of idea of how you did T5 came out of a group of people who thought differently. Now, without John Egan, who thought that was, and without his mates who used to send us all off to go and see, we found ourselves tapped into a group of people who didn't buy any of that crap. Their model was more. This is my view. I might be wrong. They grew out of Toyota. They grew out of the machine that changed the world. They grew out, people like John Neal, who's just retired as chief executive of Unipart. They grew out of a passion for making people's lives better and getting better output through creating better companies. They didn't have this terrible kind of transactional view of the world. And I think what we underestimated was that stranglehold that kind of thinking had within both the construction industry, the infrastructure sector, and particularly within government. And so, you came whack up against people. I remember last bit of this. I remember talking to Dan. Some of you, well, you guys all know Dan Jones. The guy who was one of the authors of The Machine That Changed the World and was my mentor on this project. It was Egan put him onto it to keep an eye on me. But I remember sitting with Dan once and say, how do you change the way something works? I go, Dan, you've studied this and all the rest of it. And he said, well, we talk about my own team. And he said, when you do something like this, it's a bit like a seesaw. He said, you have 10% of the people down the opposite end of the seesaw trying to stop you. You have 10% of the people up your end of the seesaw who are delighted you've arrived, and who are passionate about what you want to do, and they're just itching to get on with it. And you have 80% of the people sitting in the middle wondering which way this is going to go. And he said, they've probably been through 4 or 5 corporate restructurings. They've had all of this stuff before, and they're just sitting waiting, which is what they do. So I said, so how do you crack this problem? He said, it's simple. The guys down the other end, you fire them, you get rid of them. He said, you don't have enough time and energy to get them to think differently. And you then focus on persuading the 80% to come down your end of the seesaw. And I think what the government missed when they published Rethinking Construction was the sheer amount of political capital that would be needed to do something as fundamental as transforming the way the UK worked.
Yeah. Wow, I couldn't think of a better way to wrap things up. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for sharing so freely of your lessons learned. I want to encourage our audience, go back and look at the recording on this and write down those principles that each one of these gentlemen talked about, because there you've got the recipe for success on any project. So thank you all very much. Duana, we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. We're going to end the webinar here. And we're going to, we hope you see you guys again next month for our next webinar. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.